Good day, all members of Canadian Citizens for Charter Rights and Freedoms, and welcome to another edition of In Hot. Remember, In Hot is a fighter pilot term used for clearance on a target with weapons loaded and armed. And today we are loaded and fully armed as we roll in on a target, and it's a bit of a mystery story today. We're going to talk about the mystery of the flu. Why did the flu disappear for 2 years? What's the story behind that tale? And today we have a pretty able wingman with us to help us discover just what happened. That's Julius Ruechel. Julius, welcome aboard. Great to have you with us again. This is not our first time together. It's our third, and I keep coming back to you because your analysis of things is so comprehensive and so insightful that it just deserves to be put out there. By the way, Julius, for those who don't know, comes to us with a geological and agricultural background, but his real forte, I think, is in data analysis, and he does that in the capital markets game, and he's turned this acumen to studying the whole field of COVID-19 viruses. Civil liberties, loss of civil liberties. And I'm just going to share here a couple of papers that I have discussed with Julius. And the first one was the lies exposed by the numbers. Recall that when we talked about that, Julius, through his data analysis, discovered that we're not talking about a pandemic of the vaccinated or the unvaccinated. We're actually talking about a pandemic of the institutionalized. And he showed with data provided by the Public Health Agency of Canada that it's the institutionalized that were the ones that were in dire risk and needed to be protected. And all of us other Canadians wandering around in the wild, really there wasn't much threat to us at all, but still we had our civil liberties lifted anyway. The second paper was The Emperor Has No Clothes. And this one was another deep dive into the data, the accepted Canadian data. And it showed that basically if you're under the age of 50 years old, the COVID-19 was basically a negligible threat to you with regards to being hospitalized, being in an ICU, or dying. And so we can see that Julius is a bit of a myth buster. And this is the kind of person you really like to have on board when you're talking about things like vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, loss of civil liberties. Hi, Julius. Great to have you on board here. And hope you had a Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a Happy New Year. Certainly, let's hope our New Year is better than the last
yes.
two.
Happy New Year to you too.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're in the third year of this. Okay. Now, the flu is back. I'm going to share a screen here again, and your paper is called The False God of Central Planning, the Mysterious Reappearance of the Flu. And here you state that colds and flus mysteriously disappeared over the last 2 years, only to return recently. And you have a chart here. Do you want to talk to this chart here that you've got up about what these waves are on the chart?
Yeah, this actually comes from the World Health Organization's flu surveillance data, and it shows really clearly how every seasonal, cold and flu season, you have these waves of flu that roll around the world, and yet all of a sudden, in around March of last year, it just kind of got cut off. It just disappeared, and it's been gone essentially for the full duration of the pandemic. And so now all of a sudden, at this, in the middle of COVID still rolling, we're now starting to see flu coming back in country after country after country. And so that was kind of the premise of this piece, is to figure out exactly why did it go away and why is it coming back? Because it's not what the public health officials have said. I mean, even they've tried to claim that it's masks and social distancing, but yes. I don't know if you have that slide handy there, where in Canada it shows very clearly how the social distancing and the mask mandates, or especially the masks, they came in 2 months after the flu already had disappeared. So at that point, was when they switched from don't wear a mask to maybe you recommend having a mask. And the first mandate was 4 months after the flu disappeared. So, I mean, that destroys the entire idea that the masks had anything to do with this.
Yeah, and so we seem to have a situation here that I've always wondered. It amazed me that the flu had gone away totally for 2 years, and I kind of thought that maybe they were just confusing testing, and they're confusing flu positive tests with COVID positive tests. But no, you point out that there's such a thing as immunity debt, and I want to point that out.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that like the flu surveillance, like the number of tests was actually equal to or higher than in previous years, and yet the flu test results went to zero. So it's like you can actually see how the test results just dropped off a cliff. And yet we also saw like countries like Japan, where in the early wave there was hardly any COVID, and yet they also had the flu disappear. So like there isn't like a one-to-one switch of flu tests being transferred to the COVID column, you know? So like it really did disappear throughout.
Okay, and I think you also raise another concept called immunity debt that we'll see plays a factor in it as well.
Yeah, it's
And
going to be, yeah.
This immunity debt thing, you're saying here that it's a known epidemiological fact that if a population has been away from, hasn't been exposed to, say, the flu for a lengthy period of time, the population loses its ability to fight that particular virus, or it might be a flu virus. And when it does come back, it's like igniting dry tinder. You have a situation where boom, it becomes a very serious wave of in this case flu. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's the immunity debt factor.
I'm not sure if we'll get to that slide, but like in New Zealand, when the RSV virus finally came back, it is just unbelievable how big of a spike. Like in 2020, they had no RSV at all. And then when it did finally turn into a new outbreak, it was like orders of, yeah, there it is. You can see how in 2021, it just all of a sudden when the RSV virus came back, it's orders of magnitude higher than it would have been in previous years. And then this is in the young kids that have, because they weren't being regularly exposed, the immune system isn't getting that regular training, so it doesn't have as quick of a response as it would have, you know, if lockdowns and all that stuff hadn't happened.
And this speaks, I think, to the fact that New Zealand was quite successful because it's an island of shutting out any kind of cases, importation of cases. So they really, shut off the COVID-19 virus, but they shut off everything. And then when things opened up a little bit, boom, we see this real spike in hospitalizations for children.
Yeah.
Occur in New Zealand, and that's I guess that's something that they didn't expect, because it looks like their experts aren't aware of these kind of epidemiological facts. But
yeah, it's quite remarkable. I mean, a lot of these concepts are quite well documented. Like, I mean, I've been pulling up all these research papers that go back for decades and decades. It's hard to imagine that our public health officials are just not aware of this. They're either so incompetent that they shouldn't be in those positions, or they are actively ignoring these things in order to push the fear and get everybody to roll up their sleeves for a vaccine.
Well, that is a really, really scary thing, because I don't know if we're going to sacrifice our civil liberties, if we're going to give up on our charter freedoms, then you think that you'd have to have a really, really good reason to do so. And it looks like the people who are sending us down this road aren't really sure what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's
I'm
remarkable.
going to let's move on to something called viral interference.
Yes.
Okay, and this is the third slide, I think. And here we see, could you talk to this? Because what we're seeing here is that the advent of a virus can actually lock out other viruses.
Yeah.
And we see kind of a competition for supremacy when it comes to these viruses. Can you talk to this? What we have highlighted here in this chart.
Yeah, because viral interference actually has, like, it was first identified back in 1929 in tobacco plants, right? Like, wow. This idea has been around for a long time, and there's different aspects to it. There's more than one reason why it happens. Part of it, though, is that once a cell is being infected by one virus. It essentially blocks an infection with another virus. And it's not a perfect scenario. There are times where you can have two viruses infecting at the same time and all that. But generally, like you actually see this in even on a smaller scale, like between these variants, where once one variant comes along, it essentially pushes out the other variant, right? And you see it in the wintertime with flu season as well, where once influenza starts, colds tend to dry up, and then once influenza peaks, then the coronavirus season comes in, and there's actually quite a strong documented evidence of how each of these viruses then can displace or interfere with the transmission cycle of the next one. So it's happening on a small scale all the time. But then when a relatively new virus comes along, like SARS-CoV-2, like the COVID virus, that because there's so little exposure in the population, there's very little cross-reactive immunity from other viruses.
Yep.
So there's a huge population of people that are going to get infected. And as a result, that is able to completely push out these other viruses until enough of the population has been exposed to this new virus, at which point it's now going to have to compete with all the other viruses on a more of a regular cold and flu season kind of endemic virus schedule.
And that's exactly what we see here with the Wuhan strain being pushed out by an EU1 variant, then an alpha, then a delta, and now the Omicron is moved into the picture and is taking over the scene.
Yeah.
So we see this viral interference take place.
Yeah, and I mean that chart that you just showed was from the UK. So I mean, each country has slightly different combinations of variants, and I mean, in many countries, the Omicron is already well advanced compared to the UK. So it's kind of you can actually see this sort of wave rippling across the world as this thing displaces the other viruses.
That's an important concept, I think, is we can kind of look into the future here a bit because we have places, countries that are ahead of Canada when it comes to maybe experiencing the virus, and also with the rollout of their vaccination programs. And I'm looking at places like Israel that were really quick off the mark, and they got their population fully vaccinated pretty well very, very quickly after the vaccines rolled out. And now I think if we look at Israel, we can probably see where Canada is going to be in maybe the next couple of months. But I've watched it unfold, and it does seem to follow through what happens in places like Israel. We usually end up down the road a few months with a Canadian situation that mirrors what's going on in Israel.
I think that's one of the things that I found interesting. I think as we get into some of these later slides, where you can see when the antibody testing shows how a population gets a high level of natural immunity, and at that point, the flu starts coming back. That viral interference is broken. And I mean, Canada is a perfect example of where the Omicron is now coming into a population that has high vaccination but extremely low natural immunity. And you can see that the virus is absolutely spreading like wildfire, despite the fact that it's not actually taking out very many people. So you can see that Omicron is extremely mild, despite the fact that we have it's spreading like crazy, which means the vaccines are not doing anything to stop spread, but it's extremely mild. So it's the best of all worlds.
Okay, I think before we get into the Canadian slides that you're talking about, I want to get a few other concepts under control here. This is the Canadian weekly deaths, and it goes basically from the rollout of the virus advent back in 2 years ago. And here, I just want to point out here, you've got COVID deaths marked out in purple here, but you'll see other deaths. This is all cause deaths. You'll see other deaths kind of tail off substantially. And this, to me, this kind of indicates that maybe some deaths are being counted towards COVID that maybe were something else. Do you see that in this chart?
Yeah, I mean, this chart, by the way, is from Milhouse Van Houten on Twitter, and anybody that's not following his account really needs to. Like, he's been putting out these charts of the sourced Statistics Canada data and from each of the provincial health departments as well. And this chart to me is like, it's the one chart that tells the story of the entire pandemic, because it goes back over 10 years and is showing week after week the all-cause mortality data. And those last two purple spikes is the COVID, pandemic. Starting, the first purple spike was the Wuhan wave, right? And then You can see this, the second one was the alpha, and now we're somewhere in the, like you don't even see anything showing up yet. But mind you, this chart doesn't come into today's dates. The data lags a little bit.
Okay.
But you can see how over those last two, during those last two spikes, you see the all-cause mortality data for like heart attacks and cancers and stuff like that dropping way down. So either COVID cures all of these other diseases, which is impossible, or there's a massive misattribution for COVID, right? Because I mean,
Okay.
the tops of those spikes kind of line up with other previous bad flu seasons. We don't see something here that was, astronomically different than any other, like the 2018, 2019 flu season was on a similar magnitude of winter deaths of the people in palliative care homes and nursing homes being harvested by a very aggressive virus that is basically harmless to most everybody else.
Yep, I like your observation there that we have some misattribution going on here, and it kind of tweaks me because just within the last day or two, we've had people like Ontario's chief medical officer say that oh, by the way, some of these people in hospital with COVID aren't really there because of COVID. They just happen to have tested with COVID after they wound up in the hospital with a broken leg or with a fractured hip or something.
Yeah, I
so
mean,
go ahead, Julius.
The director of the CDC in the United States, she actually had to admit on camera here the other day that they have no idea what percentage of the COVID deaths are deaths with versus from COVID.
Wow.
And I mean,
so we're talking about a situation where we don't know this, we don't know that. There's a misattribution going on. And now the latest news of the day is, well, maybe everybody needs to be vaccinated. Maybe we have to have a countrywide, everybody gets vaccinated program. And,
good luck to them.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like we have all the information available that we need to make such a call, as far as I can see.
And I mean, the other thing too that's come up over and over again, as you said, like the percentage of people that are actually in hospital being treated for something else that have a positive PCR test. In South Africa, it was 76% of the hospitalizations were actually something else, and then they got a PCR test while at hospital. Okay. In the early part of this pandemic, the statistics on children that were 64% of the kids that were in one of the Toronto districts there that were hospitalized with COVID were actually there for other things and had a PCR test. 64%, and Quebec just admitted 40% of theirs were are hospitalized for something else. So I mean, you can immediately take all these numbers and drop them way down.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Now, as we proceed here, I'm going to show another slide, and this one, we have to get this concept. You talked about adaptive immunity at the start of our little discussion here, but there's another kind of immunity that you talk about, and it's innate immunity.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit of a backgrounder on innate immunity?
Yeah, it's actually remarkable that the public health officials never seem to want to differentiate this, that there are different portions of our immune responses, right? And then, everything to do with, for example, the vaccines is about, teaching the layers of our immune system that can actually, recognize and then produce a specialized response to something. That's what the whole idea of vaccination is all about, right? Yeah. Whereas, and that is a very powerful portion of the immune system. However, there's the other part, like the innate immune response, is basically, these are like the generalists. They don't learn, they don't recognize anything specific. They attack anything that comes through the door that looks like an intruder that shouldn't be there. And so, the immune response that initially happens, like you first see an increase in all of these innate, non-specialized antibodies that produces a surge. And then a few weeks later is when the adaptive immune response, which is slower, can finally mount its attack. So there's different layers here. But one of the ideas behind this viral interference is that, if the innate immune response to a virus, like you say you're infected by a cold virus, it boosts your innate immune response. Like it basically stimulates more of those antibodies. And then until those fade away, you actually have a much higher level of defenses against something else. And so that is also one of the reasons why something like influenza won't be able to infect as easily once you're already infected with this other virus, right?
Okay.
Like in 2009, during the swine flu pandemic, the
Mhm.
influenza took off, and then all of a sudden, the cold started taking off, and it knocked everything else out. But it's possible that, one of these issues is this innate immune response, being able to block. Once you get infected by one, then the influenza virus couldn't jump in anymore because there was already so many of these non-specific antibodies floating around.
Okay, so I think we're starting to see a flow of human bodily responses to a new threat like COVID-19, for example. Initially, we're going to see an innate immune response, which is going to play a pretty significant part in blocking out other viruses.
Yeah.
That's going to be followed by an adaptive immune response, and I guess if we look at this at a societal level, we can see this is what they talk about when they talk about herd immunity, where we're getting the population is becoming its total adaptive immune response on a population-wide basis is developing herd immunity. And then when we have that herd immunity on board, then that's when we see the pandemic fade into an endemic phase, and we see flu start. Do I have it right there?
That's right. Yeah, because I think once the adaptive immune response has been trained, it makes it much easier for it to come in and fight the next time that you're exposed, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is one of the things that has been talked about all the time. Well, once natural immunity comes along, then COVID becomes a non-issue because you can't get infected again. Well, I think with these respiratory viruses, I think that's oversimplifying it, because once you have an adaptive immune response, you can still be infected by future waves in the same way that you can be with other coronaviruses or the cold or the influenza, but you have enough immunity from the last time that it prevents you from having a bad outcome. It's able to mount a response or an attack on these intruders so fast that it no longer becomes a threat to you. And I think that's the concept that needs to actually be in the public sphere, because otherwise, every time, like, look at South Africa is having an Omicron wave right now, even though they have high natural immunity, but it isn't really affecting anybody. This is what we should be expecting. It's not actually unusual behavior.
Well, I'm seeing a little bit of an issue here, a little bit of a problem. We're being told on a daily basis now that if you're vaccinated, that's you can still spread it. You're going to spread it around like anybody else, I guess. But if you're vaccinated, it's going to tamp down the symptoms. It's going to tamp down the adverse impact of being infected. But what you're saying here, it sounds like there's another aspect to this. Maybe it's not the vaccines. Maybe it's the natural adaptive immunity that's kind of set in and is tamping down the adverse impacts of the infection.
Very much so. I mean, this was one of the interesting things that came up during, like, I have showed in this investigative report comparing Sweden to Germany, right? And in the later fall and early winter here, both of them were being exposed to the Delta. Like, Omicron hadn't arrived yet. And the only real difference between Sweden and Germany is that, Germany is highly vaccinated, so is Sweden. But Sweden has high natural immunity, whereas Germany has, used lockdowns to slow the rest of the population being exposed. So they have low natural immunity. And so the same exact variant in Sweden was producing absolutely no deaths. Like, it was just a non-event. Whereas in Germany, they had that huge wave of cases and deaths all of a sudden. So
okay, and that could be attributed to the fact that Sweden let their population roam the streets wild in abandon
yeah.
instead of locking down like Germany did. Okay.
Yeah, and Sweden has the flu. The flu is back because they came in right after they reached their high natural immunity, whereas Germany, despite the high vaccination rate, the flu is still missing.
Okay, let's talk about the flu coming back then, because I got another slide here.
I think the only other point. Oh, you go ahead. Is that the about the interferons?
No, I just wanted to show India here. This is your one of your World Health Organization charts, and it shows the successive waves of the virus of infections, and here we have the flu returns. So here we see this whole process of natural immunity really kicking in, because as we say here at this time, India only had 5% of its population immunized,
Yeah.
vaccinated.
Yeah.
And the flu is returning even still. And that is our indicator that the pandemic is over in India and they're in the endemic phase.
Very much so. I just wanted to quickly go back to, there's another, like, so that people understand this concept of viral interference. There's one other portion of it that's been highlighted as far as explaining why it happens. And one of those is they're called interferons, and they're signaling proteins that are released by cells when they're infected. And so those cells, those proteins basically serve as messengers to tell surrounding cells, you need to boost your innate immune response, those non-specific ones, in order to block out, there's a threat roaming around, basically, right? So
Okay.
that, and those interferons have, they've been known since the 50s. And it's sort of a similar concept to, like, I don't know if you've heard of acacia trees in Africa, where if they get grazed really hard by kudus, they start releasing ethylene gas. And so that ethylene gas serves as, again, some kind of a chemical messenger that other trees, once they notice that ethylene gas, like, it interacts with their leaves, and they start producing much higher levels of tannin. And so all of a sudden, the acacia leaves grazed in a big way on one tree will make the next, like the neighboring acacia tree, extremely toxic to the kudus, and it'll kill them. So it's the same, it's a different process, but it's the same idea, where a chemical messenger released by a cell that's under attack can signal to surrounding cells to boost the immune responses, the innate immune response, in order to block out another infection.
So we have a situation where the interferons are like the telegraph service of the Old West, where they could send out an SOS to all the cells in the vicinity and give them a heads up on the threat.
That's right.
Wow.
And so I think and that's kind of also when, looking at that chart from India, for example, like, there's a point where if the adaptive immune response is able to kick in and take out the virus that comes in, then you don't need all of these other, like, you don't have such a strong innate immune response where there's signaling proteins being released and all that. And that's why the flu suddenly comes in. And that's why, like, when it doesn't matter that India had only a 5% vaccination rate, they suddenly had, like, an exceedingly high, can't remember what the number was, like up to 97%, I think, in the city of Delhi. Once you reach that point, there's no longer all these other innate immune responses that are strong enough to block out influenza from coming in. Boom, there it is.
Okay, then let's, we have India. Let's talk about, here we have Brazil, basically the same kind of setup here, where we have the waves, and then we have, this is influenza. The influenza goes away for 2 years, and then boom, it returns.
Yeah.
And we see the vaccination levels there are similarly quite low, but we have a lot of natural immunity forming over the course of the 2 years there.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about all of these charts as well is that, we've been focusing on PCR cases, and you go and you look at most of these countries, you say, well, there's no way that, based on the number of PCR cases, that there's enough of the COVID virus to block out and trigger that kind of an interfering immune response in the entire population. Mm-hmm. And yet you look at India. In India, there was a PCR test that covered something like 910 million people out of, PCR test covered 30 million people. And the antibody testing, basically, they were covering something up, like I said, up to 97% of the city of Delhi. So that works out to 910 million people that already have antibodies. So the PCR test actually only covered about 3% of all infections. Oh so even though there's all of these problems with the PCR testing, it's actually sort of a sideshow to how many people are actually being exposed and developing antibodies. It's way more.
If that's the case, then shouldn't we be doing antibody testing instead of antigen testing to see how much natural immunity there is out there? Shouldn't we be taking a look at that?
There's been some tests done, but again, like you said, the fact that it isn't being done more often, it's crazy. Like, it's this focus on PCR is actually taking away the focus on that much more important part. South Africa already hit 80% antibodies, right? Even though there's a very small number of people that ever had a PCR test that came back positive, that were even sick enough to bother getting a PCR test. So
Okay, so if we're going to be talking in Canada about mass vaccination, mandatory mass vaccination programs, shouldn't we have that data available to the general public? Shouldn't the public know just how much natural immunity is out there and where we are in this this pandemic? Maybe we're in the endemic phase already.
No, actually, like there wasn't a PCR, or sorry, antibody testing that was done early on. Like what they would do is go to the blood clinics and for like a small window of time, see how many people had antibodies, and that, you know, then project that out onto the rest of the population, kind of like an election poll. And I can't remember, I think it was in May and June of 2020. You know, our lockdowns had been so severe that we essentially had no immunity. Like there was, I can't remember what it was, like under 1% or something like that. Right.
Okay, so Canada is still a low natural immunity country.
That's right. Like at the same, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think Sweden after that first wave was already in the 15 to 20% range.
Okay.
Right. So like that gives you a sense of just how much the lockdowns slowed the natural exposure of all these extreme, like they're so mild that most people were asymptomatic. They never even knew that they were exposed. They just developed antibodies and that's it. There's nothing else, you know?
So in other words, this lockdown strategy, if anything, it impeded our progress through this crisis.
Well,
it slowed us down.
It's remarkable. Like if you look at the all-cause mortality in Sweden, and I mean, they've admitted that they screwed up on protecting the nursing homes as far as not like making sure that, because there's always a lockdown around a nursing home. They have a door, and if you don't let anybody in it, that's it. They're in lockdown, right? And so instead of, you know, these waves last, you know, 6 to 8 weeks through the winter. So that's when there's the big dying waves. Well, lock the door during that period, let everybody else go about their life and carry on. So, but even though they had those problems, they didn't have a higher overall mortality than many other countries. But so like their all-cause mortality in 2020, when they had all their dying, it takes them from back up to a death rate similar to 2012. Like it's basically hardly an increase. And it's now, like I saw here this morning, something about how in 2021, their all-cause mortality is the second lowest on record.
My goodness, that's Sweden. So
yeah, the only year that
Swedes.
The only year that has a lower all-cause mortality in Sweden was 2019. Like these are stunningly low numbers, and it shows you just how much we're messing around with, you know, what should be like. That's the thing, is that once everybody else has been exposed in a normal wave like that isn't dangerous to most people, then you can open the doors. And now the folks in the old folks homes in Sweden in 2021 were basically not at risk because there's such a high level of natural immunity in the population. That's how herd immunity should work.
Okay, let's talk about, that's very interesting about Sweden. Maybe that's why we never hear anything about Sweden these days, because of the progress they've made in this virus.
Yeah, they're a big embarrassment to everybody else.
My goodness, yeah. Let's look at, I think we talked about South Africa. Let's look at, this is COVID deaths in Canada. And here we have a situation that despite the fact that PCR case numbers during Omicron already outnumber cases during any of the other previous surges, so far, hospitalization rates with Omicron are pretty flat. They're pretty flatline there.
Yeah.
What do you have anything about this particular chart that strikes your fancy?
Yeah, in fact, if I could share, let me just see here. If I could share my screen for a second, because the numbers have been a little bit updated since I published this.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see the chart here, newly confirmed COVID cases per million people.
That's what I'm looking at.
Okay, so where's Canada? Here's Canada. So you can see on there how like the number of Omicron cases by now is, you know, far exceeds anything that we've seen like with PCR testing in previous waves. Like at this point, like, it is now finally reaching everyone, which is why there's so many people now coming down with something. And yet, despite this huge wave of something coming through, you can switch to deaths, and the deaths have not mirrored that. They're up a little bit, but like I said, how much of that is even misattribution? Like these are tiny numbers in a massive population. And the same thing for hospitalizations. Like the hospitalizations do not mirror that massive increase in PCR positive tests. So that actually speaks to just how mild Omicron is in Canada.
Well, it looks like Omicron might be a Christmas gift, to Canada because it is so mild, and it gives, at the same time, it's getting our natural immunity status way up.
Very much so. I think it's doing what the vaccines were supposed to and are unable to do.
Wow, exactly. Okay, anything else on those slides you want to show us?
I think that's probably a good. I think that covers it.
Okay, because now I want to, if you can stop share.
Oh, sorry. Where do I do that here? There we go.
There you go. If you can stop share, I'm going to share this because now we got information out of Quebec.
Yes.
And now we talk about, this is the pandemic of the unvaccinated. This is, coming out of Quebec, and I've seen Ontario numbers too, and the Ontario numbers are pretty close to what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
But we're looking at, cases, hospitalizations, and those in the ICU. This is from 4 January, so it's not too long ago.
No, this one's
We're
really
seeing
recent.
the percentages of the vaccinated that are showing up as cases in hospital and in the ICU are substantial. Now you could say that, okay, but there's so many more vaccinated people than there are unvaccinated people in the province. But if you look at the 28-day average, you'll see that the cases today have climbed substantially from the 28-day average. So we are definitely, it looks like the vaccinated are taking up more and more hospital and ICU space as time goes by. Any comments on that?
Well, I mean, that chart essentially blows the entire idea out of the water that you need to take this vaccine to protect somebody else. If everybody has an opportunity to be infected with this, then where is the case for mandated or coerced vaccination? If you want it, you can protect yourself, but it has no bearing whatsoever on anybody else. Well,
this whole thing about being a good public citizen, about the public good, and about being patriotic and saving grandma, it's all a bunch of codswallop.
Yeah,
because if you're vaccinated, you're going to spread this stuff around and get infected just like anybody else.
That's right.
Well,
and I mean,
okay.
That's the thing. Like, if when you see these kinds of numbers of infections among the vaccinated, like there's just no rationale for any of this stuff anymore. Like, it's time to admit that if you want it, fine, take this vaccine, but understand that it's not actually stopping anything at all anymore. Like, everybody is ending up with something. It really comes down to an informed consent, personal, risk reward calculation. And I mean, yeah. I don't see a case for it at all for anybody at this point.
So at best, I guess we could say the vaccines are a private initiative that you could take based on your own personal risk benefit analysis,
yeah.
And that it's not it doesn't do anything for the public good. It's all about the private. It's all about the private or the individual's risk benefit analysis, and that puts everything in a totally different light than what is being presented with today's messaging from the government, from public health.
Well, I think the other thing that needs to be put into perspective here is what these actual numbers are. Like, if I can share here another screen.
Go ahead. Yep.
Okay, so these are the numbers coming out of Quebec, right? So there are, I did the numbers, what was posted last night, which was there's new numbers here today, but I'll use the numbers that I saw yesterday. So there was 2,133 hospitalizations in the entire province of Quebec.
Okay.
Now, Quebec has a population of over 8 million. These are absolutely tiny, tiny numbers. The idea that our hospital system is collapsing because of 2,000 hospitalizations is ludicrous. Now, of those 2,133 hospitalizations, our Quebec Minister of Health has admitted that 40% of those are actually people hospitalized and being treated for something completely different that had a PCR test after they were hospitalized that came up positive, right? So if you knock out those, that's 40%. So all of a sudden, instead of 2,133, you're actually down to 1,280 people that are in hospital for COVID. The
Yes.
idea that our healthcare system is collapsing because of this is ridiculous. However, they've got something like 20,000 healthcare workers that are on leave because of Omicron. Now, I don't know what percent, if they're fudging those numbers to include the healthcare workers that have also been laid off because they're unvaccinated. But let's assume that this is, 20,000 healthcare workers laid off because of Omicron. What they're laid off for is a positive PCR test. Most of those people, like there isn't 20,000 of them that are deadly ill.
No.
Chances are most of them don't even have symptoms based on how the rest of this clown show has evolved, right? So
Well,
at this point, you're going like, how can you justify, letting go of 20,000 people that are, most of which are asymptomatic, and then claiming that the hospitals are not capable of treating people? Asymptomatic spread is a virtual nothing event. Like it almost never happens. We've never prevented we've never tested hospital workers to whether they have influenza or other coronaviruses or rhinoviruses before they come to work, and then said, well, you may not have any symptoms, but you're not allowed to come to work for 2 weeks. Like this is a purely manufactured crisis of the hospital system. If COVID was actually dangerous, there would be field hospitals set up to keep the COVID patients separate from everybody else, and that's how you would manage it. We don't see any of that.
It looks like a whole series of unforced errors, like in baseball. You have an unforced error. It's someone drops the ball that he should have caught, and it's called an unforced error. It seems like we have a whole bunch of unforced errors going on here with our approach to this particular so-called crisis, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and now we're talking about. I believe our Prime Minister is talking about shutting down truck travel across the border into the United States because unless people are fully vaccinated. Yeah. Once again, we're seeing an unforced error where we're taking good, healthy truck drivers off the road because of what? I have no idea. What do you have here, Julius?
Yeah, I was going to just to add to what you just said. I mean, like our public health officials and media keep saying that all of these other things are because of the pandemic. These are not issues that are caused by the virus. These are all caused by government policies. Like this is purely now a manufactured crisis because of government decisions, not because the virus is taking out truckers, not because the virus is taking out hospital staff. It's pure politics that's causing this.
And we talk about your paper. This particular paper doesn't talk about asymptomatic spread, but I think it's a known epidemiological fact that if you're asymptomatic, basically your viral load can never be large enough to cause a spread of the infection. I think I saw early on in the crisis, China in Wuhan, they did a study of 10 million people, which was very, very ambitious, but they went through all the contact tracing associated with people who were infected, and they found that it was extremely rare that anybody who was asymptomatic passed the disease on. Yeah. Extremely rare.
Yeah, I mean the World Food Program, I think it was. I've referenced who it was that said it. It was either the World Food Program or the World Bank, has said that in Africa, over 410,000 people have died of malaria in the same time that 30,000 people died with or from COVID. Yes. Just to put a perspective of just how we've magnified this thing into proportions that are completely it's perverse, and that the lockdowns in Africa have already put, I think, 50 million children that are no longer getting the free food that they needed from lunch hour meals at schools, and 250 million children that have basically been out of school for 2 years without any online. Most of them have no access to online learning. Like the long-term consequences of this completely ridiculous lockdown type of response and forcing people into taking medical treatments to have access to a future, it is just ridiculous.
We are coming to the end of our time together. I could keep talking about this stuff forever with you, Julius. So I mean, you're just such a font of information, and the data you collect and collate is really comprehensive, and it speaks to a superior ability. I still classify you as one of our Canada's national treasures. I really do.
Thank you. If I could just add one more point about Kenya, because it's an interesting story. It's the one place where the flu did not disappear. I mean, there's a couple other countries as well in Africa, but this low level of death in Africa, it's actually that the entire virus behaved so mildly in Africa that it did not produce that viral interference response that we see in other countries.
Wow.
And that's a really bizarre thing. And it actually speaks to how differences in lifestyle is what's making the variants either more or less dangerous in the population. So rather than focusing so much on, how to, push out a vaccine on everybody, why aren't public health officials using examples like that to recognize we need to be educating the public on what they can do to prevent it, how to reduce their risk? Because I mean, if an entire continent can avoid this, and part of it is, you can say that a country like Kenya has a lot less elderly as a proportion of the population compared to a country like Canada. But they also they're living with a very high number of people that are permanently with HIV, which is one of the comorbidities that increases your risk to a bad outcome from COVID. They also, in the urban parts of the country, the obesity rates are over 60%, which is one of the biggest risk factors for a bad outcome from COVID. And they still don't have all of these issues. Like I'm
wondering if things like added exposure to sunlight and vitamin D would be a factor, but then it couldn't be, because our former Minister of Health told us that vitamin D was fake news. Remember that?
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, we know that the vitamin D has a major role in boosting the innate immune response. So do many other vitamins. We know that depression and stress and things like and loneliness can reduce an immune response. So like the public health officials are doing everything, intentional or unintentional, is not part of it's irrelevant. The point is the things that they're doing are actually making people more vulnerable.
Wow.
And it's not even that they're not educating people, it's that they're actually doing things to reduce our ability to have a strong immune response if we are exposed.
Well, maybe they need to educate themselves, and maybe they should start with ceasing to censor opposing voices and views that come out of doctors, experts. We have Nobel laureates who are spoken out on the way the West is approaching this crisis, and they get shut down, and people like Dr. Robert Malone get suspended and shut down from Twitter because he's saying the unpopular thing. Maybe they should start there.
The moment that you suspend a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where you're limiting the ability for some people to talk, you essentially remove the pressure on the government to engage in scientific evidence-based debate. Right? At that point, it's basically a political decision, everything that goes on. And so you destroy all the checks and balances that ensure that mistakes like this don't get made. So even if it's not...
Maybe we should leave it there, because that, on that note, Charter rights and freedoms, fundamental individual rights and freedoms is where C3RF lives.
Yes.
And quite frankly, I never wanted to get wrapped up with this medical stuff but I'm finding that it is being used as such a blunt hammer to bash away at our individual rights and freedoms that one has to come out and talk about it. Because, as you say, if you can't talk about it, which is the case now, you can't solve it. If you can't talk, you can't solve. So I'd invite people to go over to www.canadiancitizens.org, join the conversation. Where can people pick up on your research and your thoughts?
Yeah, the best place is my website, www.juliusruechel.com. And then from there, they can find my social media links and all of that kind of stuff. But that's the best place to find me.
Well, thanks for your inspired work. Your analysis is really appreciated, Julius. And I'll be keeping an eye on what you come up with next. So thanks so much. C3RF.
Thanks so much. I always enjoy talking with you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.